Hello, everybody. Welcome to this to this Twitter Spaces hosted by the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. We're here to talk about Ukrainian resilience. We've got an excellent panel. I'll give people a moment to get settled in, and we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Sam Green. I'm director of the Program for Democratic Resilience at the Center for European Policy Analysis. I'm very, very pleased to welcome an excellent panel to today's discussion, which I'll introduce in a moment as we get to the conversation. We got together a few weeks ago and decided that we needed to, or now even more than a month ago, decided we needed to have a conversation revisiting questions of Ukrainian resilience. When we first planned this event, it was really in the context of what was looking like a successful counteroffensive, particularly in the northeast, but increasingly in the south. And while Ukraine still seems to maintain the advantage on the front line, we're seeing increasing barbarity from the other side. Barbarity designed, it seems to me, to attack not simply the resilience of the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian state, but really the resilience of Ukrainian society. That then is what we're going to try to talk about today. Not suggesting that we ignore the military side of things. Of course, we will take a look at that as well, but we'll take a wider angle on what resilience means and what it requires. We have, as I mentioned, a really excellent group of people with us today. We have Dr. Vladimir Dubovic, who is associate professor in the Department of International Relations at Mechnikov National University in Odessa, currently joining us from Boston, if I'm not mistaken, where he's just started as a visiting fellow at the Fletcher School for Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Welcome, Volodymyr. We have Tanya Lokat joining us, if I'm not mistaken, from from Dublin, where she is associate professor in the School of Communications at Dublin City University. We have Olga Tokaryuk, who's a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, and recently inaugurated, I think just this month, fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University in the UK. And joining us from Ukraine, again, if I'm not mistaken, is Dr. Hanna Shelest, who is also a senior fellow in the Transatlantic Defense and Security Program at CEPA and director of the Security Studies Program at Ukrainian PRISM of the Foreign Policy Council there. So welcome, everybody, to the conversation. Hanna, if I might turn to you first to set the scene. Can you describe for us the contrast between the progress that Ukraine is making in the east and the south on the front lines and the destruction that Russia is causing day after day in cities across the country?
Thank you, Sam. That is a great pleasure to be with you. And definitely the situation on the ground is changing dramatically, but at the same time, changing quite differently from the region to the region. A few weeks ago, we just experienced and saw the fantastic counteroffensive on the north around the Kharkiv region, and everybody expected that probably the same tempos, the same speed, the same scope will go in all other regions as well. But we understand that such operations are prepared carefully and lonely, and what we see in the news is probably a day or two. So now we have more and more information that the counteroffensive is happening in a different mode, but happening on the south around Kherson. At the same time, we know that very heavy fightings are happening in Lugansk and Donetsk regions. And that is really important because after Kharkiv, definitely the Lugansk region looks as the next one for the liberation. But at the same time, we also see the change of the Russian tactics, understanding that they are losing, that they are defeating from many territories. They change not only rhetoric, because this rhetoric is happening from that they are fighting not with Ukrainians, but with NATO, to the rhetoric that they are not going back, like stepping back, but they're just regrouping. So definitely they have a certain confusion. But we see the great mobilization. We already see these waves of mobilization of the Russians at our territory. And we see the increased attacks of the Iranian drones. Last Monday, it was all around the news with the shelling just in downtown Kyiv, but also all around the country against the critical infrastructure, first of all, the heating and electrical stations, And today, unfortunately, we have the same sad day because again, shooting with the Iranian drones just in the downtown Kiev and against many other territories. That is, we can't say that that is really the change, strategic change of the situation, but that gives additional elements to this because we understand that Russians are at the strategic level threatened by the nuclear weapons. At the tactical level, they are trying to hit what is important for the people, to bring the fear and the panic with like it is autumn, winter is close, it's already cold in many cities. In Kiev, it is +1 in the morning, for example. When you're hitting electrical and heating stations, that would bring a lot of suffering for the civilians, and that's what they are targeting as for now.
Thank you for that. We're going to come back and talk about a lot of that in a bit more detail. But for the moment, Ola, I'll turn to you. Putin, as Hannah has described, and as we're seeing in the news every day, right, is clearly trying to brutalize ordinary Ukrainian citizens and to weaken their willingness to keep fighting. Is he succeeding, and can he even succeed?
Hello, Sam. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be a part of this excellent panel today, and thank you, SIPA, for organizing this important debate. Well, answering your question, I think he's not succeeding, and he's not going to succeed because what we've seen today and last week when Russians again attacked Kyiv, when they launched missiles on Kyiv, and when today they launched the Iranian-made kamikaze drones, we are seeing that the response of Ukrainians is not fear, but rather anger and again mobilization and resilience and willingness to continue the resistance and continue to defending their country, defending their land, their loved ones who are still in Ukraine. And speaking of this resilience, two images come to my mind in the past, that I saw in the past 24 hours. Maybe you've also seen these images on social media. The first is a photo of Ukrainian children who are playing at the playground in the hole actually made by Russian missile that landed there just last Monday. It's a playground in central Kyiv, in one of most popular Kyiv's parks, Shevchenko Park. And to see this image, this photo of children and their parents just standing there at this playground and children playing there in this hole that the missile left, it really sent shivers down my spine in a sense that it is heartbreaking, of course, to see, what Ukrainian children have to endure because of Russia's aggression, but it's also very kind of, it sends this message of very strong resilience that people are still staying in Ukraine. They are still living there. They refuse, to escape, to give up, to surrender, to be paralyzed by fear, that the life still continues. And another image is from today of Ukrainian residents of Kyiv trying to shoot down these Iranian drones with the rifles. And today, even the Ukrainian Ministry of Interior had to issue a statement calling on ordinary citizens not to try to take down these drones on their own. This kind of also indicates and demonstrates how even ordinary citizens with very limited means that they have at their disposal are contributing to this resistance and resilience and, and fending off Russian aggression.
Thank you. Yeah, we've all seen those pictures. I'm in the UK at the moment and was able to attend an anti-war rally on Parliament Square yesterday, where I ran into a Ukrainian friend of mine whose mother actually has been visiting, spending time with her in the UK, and is planning next week on going back to Kiev. And for those who I think of us who are not as closely tied to or connected to the conflict and to the situation in Ukraine, that might seem like an odd thing, but I think it does reflect the degree of resolve, Ola, that you're talking about. It is really quite remarkable. And Tatiana, Ukrainians have rallied around not only their flag and their state, the way people often do at wartime, but have rallied around one another really to a remarkable degree since this war began. When you look at the Ukrainian media space in particular, what do you think are the sources of that cohesiveness? And are there any risks that it might fracture?
Remarkable examples of resilience, and I think the media space writ large, which we take to understand both the kind of mainstream media, but also the social media space and the horizontal networks of communication, has really played a central role in supporting this resilience among Ukrainians and Ukrainian population, not just inside the country, but also obviously outside the country and all of the various diaspora communities and allies as well. I think to me, one of the core things that really shows, what one of the kind shows the reason for this cohesiveness is that people have indeed learned to rely on one another, and they don't necessarily depend on the state. Also in how they participate in the war, and how they support their army, how they fundraise, how they volunteer. So the horizontal networks are just as, if not more important at this point for Ukraine's struggle as what the state is doing and what the army is doing. And at the same time, the individuals, the citizens, they also understand how important, what the army and the state is doing. But at the same time, they don't feel like they're tied to supporting them unequivocally, right? There's still space for debate. There's still space for disagreement. And those disagreements and debates do happen sometimes in the media space, but they are all the more meaningful, right? Because they show that there is this democratic space for different voices, where people discuss the role of language, the role of the state, the role of diplomacy, and all of these things. So really, a joke that somebody made this morning, and I think has been made multiple times, is that, why is Russia targeting civilian objects and civilian infrastructure? Because in Ukraine, as we know, people are the source of power and they're the ones who make decisions. So of course they're targeting centers of decision making, i.e. civilian, residential housing and blocks and playgrounds. So really, to me, this amount of different narratives that somehow coexist quite comfortably on Ukrainian social media, where people talk about their very personal stories, escaping from occupied territories, having been displaced twice or more, depending on where you come from in Ukraine over the past 8 years, or stories of explaining to others who may not know the importance of Ukrainian art or Ukrainian culture, or just how much Ukraine is beyond what we can see in the headlines. I think all of those, to me, are the most important sources of cohesiveness and sources of resilience that are really
Seems to be a little bit of an issue with the connection there, Tanya. I think we lost the last few words of your comment, but hopefully I think everybody got the point. We'll come back to you in a moment, but I want to turn now to Volodymyr. Zelensky is asking for air defenses. I feel like I've lost track of the number of times he's asked for air defenses and not really received quite what Ukraine has requested, right? The West does seem to be trying a little bit more, but partly still failing to provide them. When you look at this picture, right, both on the front lines and the picture of social resilience under a lot of pressure that Tanya, Olga, and Hannah have just described for us, what support can and should Western countries be providing now to help keep Ukraine resilient in this new phase of the war?
Right. Well, I think that what we're asking is air defense, and that's the right thing to do. But we're also asking other things. It's also shiftable, dynamic, evolving lists of the arms that Ukraine needs, and there are many of those. In terms of air defenses, some people already said in the recent weeks that Russian massive missile attacks on Ukrainian cities have probably even been, useful in terms of for our allies to understand that we need those air defenses, and sending more of them in a more rushed, immediate, urgent manner. So that is probably working to our benefit, because we're already receiving some from US, from Germany, other places. So it might be even a positive thing that Putin decided to send this avalanche of missiles. I mean, obviously not positive in terms of destruction and loss of human life, but better in terms of air defenses, because we've been asking for those for a long time, and only now our allies understand that we really truly need them. Another thing on this escalation by Putin is that we are seeing this escalation, and we are also on. I also always understood that Putin is not going to be just at some point of time acknowledging and admitting his defeat and going back home, with his tail between his legs, and say, "Okay, you Ukraine, you can have your territories back. Just give me an off ramp or something." That's not his style. Never been, and I think he's doubling down. We're always seeing in recent days first so-called annexation and so on, and then so-called referenda, and then this barrage of missile flying into Ukrainian cities, and again today in Kyiv in the morning. So I think that's his message, and actually it's a big lesson in terms of escalation, because if you think that you shouldn't be giving Ukraine certain types of weapons because it might provoke Russia for escalation towards escalation. It's otherwise. The lesson is different. I mean, if you stop providing Ukraine with more and more sophisticated and deadly weapons, you send a signal to Moscow that, okay, fine, there is a limit, that there is a red line that the West wouldn't go through across, and therefore the chances for Russia to escalate is increasing. And what he's doing as well, Putin, I mean, it's message to not just to Ukraine, it's message to his domestic audience and to the West. The domestic audience, he's really replying to those who is thinking, validly so, legitimately so, that Russia is losing. So therefore, he needs to show something new, something more massive and systemic, and all of this shelling has been welcomed by a lot of people on the right in Russia, and to the West as well, because he's saying basically, look, Ukraine is probably moving forward slowly in counteroffensives, liberating some of their lands, but we still have upper hand with missiles and everything. We can destroy Ukraine. Do you want this future for Ukraine? And many people in the West are saying, no, let's stop the war now. Ukraine might, still continue counteroffensives or not, but at the moment, Russia is just destroying the country, and the time and the money that would be needed for recovery and rebuilding is increasing manifold. So he is really playing on these attitudes in the West and the sentiments that the war should be stopped right now, maybe at Russia's conditions, because otherwise we would have Ukraine being damaged and basically destroyed.
Indeed, I'm going to actually press you on some of that in a second, because there's a question that's come in on the comment. But before I do that, I would invite anybody listening in to go ahead and post questions in replies to the Twitter Spaces. I'll see them and try to read as many of them out as I can. We have one now that really speaks, Volodya, exactly to what you were talking about, right? So Rudy Myers asks, why don't we, and by we, I think he means the United States, but I suppose the West more broadly, why don't we make it clear that the alliance will provide weapons to Ukraine if Russia continues to target civilians and infrastructure with long-range missiles? And I think what he means is, he says, equal weapons. So in other words, the ability for Ukraine to strike inside Russian territory. I don't know whether you want to comment at all on some of the pictures we've seen from Belgorod, but in general, does it make sense for Ukraine to try to take this war to the other side of the border?
Well, I think we should definitely target the targets. I mean, aim targets in Russia that are being used for attacks on Ukraine. Also in Belarus, by the way. And yes, it's a dangerous precedent. I mean, it could actually lead to some escalation and more internationalization of the conflict. But it's been acknowledged already by our allies, including in Washington, D.C., that Ukraine has a legitimate right to attack those installations and bases and towns and cities from which the missiles are being launched, or airplanes taken off, for instance, to bomb Ukraine. So it's quite legitimate targets, and others in the West have said the same thing. So I think that's what Ukraine is doing, and being very moderate, actually, and restrained in terms of what we're doing in the Russian territory. But in terms of weapons supply, yes, we should be getting more of the weapons supply as well. And anytime there is an escalation in the Russian part, again, there are two narratives that I mentioned. One, let's give Ukraine even more weapons because of what Russia is doing, because it's not fair, because Ukraine is a victim of the aggression, and so we need to give them weapons. And others saying, no, let's stop doing that, putting more fuel into the fire. Ukraine is not going to win. It's just senseless and hopeless. Russia is still going to have an upper hand. There will be dragged out war. So why don't we stop it right now and basically tell Ukrainians, sit down and sign something with Putin. That would be a bad deal, but as they say, improperly, not correctly, the bad peace is better than the good war or something like that. So no, unfortunately not. Of course, Ukraine is exhausted, and the public wants, and the military wants, and the political leadership. We want the cessation of hostilities. We want the end of this war sooner the better, but at the same time, not at any expense, not in any conditions. And there is no appetite at all for Ukrainian society to stomach some kind of a concessions, major concessions on territories. So sovereignty of Ukraine being delivered to Russia as a reward for their ongoing aggression. So therefore, the mood is that we're going to go on. And I hope that there is enough of countries in the West that understand that, and they continue supplying financial assistance and the weapons as well. And that I would emphasize as well. We're not only getting weapons, we're also getting tons of financial assistance, which is needed for Ukrainian economy to survive. We're also getting assistance for our IDPs in Ukraine. We're getting assistance for our refugees in the West. So there's many facets of assistance Ukraine is getting, and we're really grateful for that, obviously. And that should go on. I think that what West is doing is basically the right thing. They should go on with assisting Ukraine weapons-wise and otherwise, and putting even more pressure on Russia in the coming months, and that might just work.
Indeed, and I think we're also seem to be seeing not just resilience, but and not just, of course, fighting, from the Ukrainian side of the line, but increasingly signs of organized resistance on the other side in Russian occupied territory. Hanna, I think this is something that you've been tracking. Can you enlighten us on that a bit? What are you seeing?
Definitely, we saw from the very first days the resistance at the territories, especially when we are talking about south of the country. And for the last 2 months, we started to hear more and more about, let's call it institutionalized or better organized resistance. So not just the sabotage of the locals or some kind of the marking the territory with Ukrainian symbols, but more and more of the movements like Yellow Ribbon, for example. So de facto, we are having the violent and non-violent resistance. The violent is seldom, but it exists with the collaborators' execution or with some explosions or with the delivery of information about the target for the Ukrainian armed forces. That's happening. But much more, we are witnessing the non-violent resistance that comprised of so many activists. And if it started predominantly in Melitopol and Kherson, now we see that the same leaflets, the same visuals are used even in Crimea. You can see that the last 2 weeks, the leaflets with the yellow ribbon, with the messages against the Russian passports, against the referendum, against like many other things, or in support of the Ukrainian armed forces, are spread from Simferopol to Melitopol to Kherson to small towns and villages. And that is impressive because what people are doing, it's not what the government are doing. It's first of all marking the space as Ukrainian with the symbols, with the flags, with something to demonstrate that Russians would feel uncomfortable. The second, it is sending the messages to the locals, what is good, what is bad. The third is targeting collaborators by showing them up, demonstrating that, okay, we know who are you, you will be punished for this, or think twice before collaborating with the Russians. But also targeting such particular things as the sham referendum at the occupied territories. Because, for example, they organized the campaign asking people to send photos of those involved or videos, and they took the face recognition program and started checking who are these people. And in many towns, they managed to demonstrate that those who were at the referendum stations, they are not even locals. That is people registered in other parts of the Russian Federation. So that is very important for demonstration what is the real situation on the ground and what Russian propaganda is trying to demonstrate. We definitely know that Russians are quite upset about this. And unfortunately, that's led to quite a natural situation, meaning that Russians increased searchings and filtration activities. They are looking for these partisans, for this resistance movement, for those who are supporting, they're catching people, because there are thousands and thousands of those who would like to join with a small help, like throwing the leaflets or putting them on the buildings or painting with a yellow and blue some buildings. So definitely it is the two-way, like with the increase of resistance, we see the increase of suppression from the Russian authorities on the ground. But that makes both collaborators and Russian military to feel extremely uncomfortable. They don't feel safe, they don't feel welcome, and they understand that they are not controlling these territories. And that's extremely important, because when the army is stationed somewhere and they are afraid to be stabbed by the knife to their back, you understand that they behave differently and they're less assured in their capabilities when the counteroffensive operation is happening. But it seems to me that this resistance movement, we should speak more about it with the international community. The reason is that, unfortunately, very often in the media, from the questions that I receive from the journalists, they're asking, but there are so many people probably who support it. Or let's look how in Crimea people supported in 2014 the Russian occupation, not understanding that sometimes people even didn't have the opportunity or possibilities without the threat to their lives to resist, because that's immediately we already know about several hundred people being arrested or disappearing, kidnapped by the Russians at the occupied territories. So people are definitely afraid of this. And when we have such a strong resistance movement, we need to speak to it to demonstrate that it is not civil war for Ukraine, or it is not some pro-Russian or Russian-speaking people who are supporting Russian. So maybe everything is not so clear. No, for people who are on the ground, everything is very clear. They would like to resist any type of the Russian presence at their territory.
Thank you. Thank you for that. It's something that clearly I think we don't hear enough about outside of Ukraine and the Ukrainian media. Olga, I want to come back to something you were talking about earlier. In the meantime, I would invite listeners to post questions as replies to the Twitter space, and I'll again try to read out what comes in. But Olga, you were helping us see a pretty remarkable picture of resilience and cohesion, and people being really so very much committed to seeing this war to a victorious conclusion, right? To the liberation of Ukraine and the end of Russian aggression. At the same time, Tanya was telling us about sort of the space that remains for pluralism, particularly in the media, for people to have disagreements and debates about how this war is being fought and what's going on. And as a journalist yourself, how do you perceive that balance? Really, the balance between sort of cohesion and democracy, really.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Not very easy to answer. Thank you, Sam. Well, Ukraine is a democracy. I think we should start every conversation by, mentioning that and reminding people about it. So even if the country is at war, and of course it imposes some constraints on, the life of civilian population and the work of the media, still Ukraine remains a democracy, and there is a freedom of speech and freedom of debate in Ukraine, not just on social media, but in the media in general. And actually there have been, there has been criticism of, for example, the way that major TV stations handle the war, that for many months they are conducting the marathon, which mostly focuses on successes but speaks very little about problems. And the fact that that this there is such criticism, and that there are other TV stations and other media who are questioning the way the government communicates, the way the other media communicate this war, I think is very remarkable, and something that maybe wouldn't happen in many other even democracies if they were in conditions of war and aggression and outright attack that Ukraine is experiencing. As a journalist, and speaking to my colleagues also, I can say that most of them say that they are able to cover this war freely. They are able to report what is happening. freely. They face no major obstructions from on behalf of the government or agencies that issue accreditations or permits. There were some individual cases when the accreditations for work and frontline were delayed, but in the end they were granted. That also applies to foreign media. So in general, Ukraine maintains its status as a democratic country and as a country where journalists are able to operate freely, even during war, and people are able to get information from different sources. So maybe they would not be very keen to watch, this TV marathon of major television stations, but then they can just switch off, to an opposition TV station, or they can disconnect from TV and get their news from online media. And they will be able to get a clear picture of what is happening. Another major factor, I think, is really this very strong presence of social media in life of Ukrainians. A lot of debates are happening there. A lot of people get their news from social media. We can, have a discussion on whether it's good or bad. But the fact that it's very difficult to hide something because there is such a huge, variety of different sources of information, and also because every Ukrainian has someone in the front line. Every Ukrainian has someone they know who had to escape from either the occupied territories or parts of Ukraine that were under heavy Russian attack. It makes this war very, very real for every person in Ukraine, regardless of their personal experience of whether they have been under bombs or not. So I really think there is no issue with the freedom of the media, freedom of speech in Ukraine.
Thank you, and thank you also for sharing your personal and your professional experience. Tatiana, I want to pick up on what Ola was just describing. Before the war, right, sort of the dominant conversation about Ukraine often was one about divisions, right? A lot of people, like Elon Musk just the other week, right, would exaggerate these dividing lines, but it was kind of what people would talk about, right? It's been common, obviously, since 2014 and certainly since February of this year, to talk about the ways in which Putin really has helped Ukrainians bridge the dividing lines of language, of geography, religion, and ideology, although I suppose that can be exaggerated too. I'm wondering what you see, as a social scientist looking at what's going on in Ukraine, right? Has this war really, forged a new kind of unity that will carry Ukraine through this war, and which there's no constituencies for Putin to exploit, as Ola is describing, or are we in danger of missing issues here?
Thanks, Sam. Again, really good questions. I hope my internet connection is a little better now. But I would say the divisions that were there or that were reported or discussed prior to the war, I think a lot of them were also not really relying on data as such. And I think social scientists, of Ukrainian ones and otherwise, have played an important part during the past several months, explaining, right, that these divisions were in many ways contrived, and that, for instance, what language you speak commonly doesn't necessarily explain what your political position is. And just because you are a Russian speaker or a majority Russian speaker, which is true for a lot of people in different regions of Ukraine, doesn't necessarily mean you support Putin or that you want Russia to occupy or annex your territory. I think the war obviously brought these things into much starker relief. I think the war and Russia's actions over, since February 2022 have also really contributed to, what you're describing as kind of forging this unity. Also because I think first of all, they made it very, very difficult for anybody to support Putin or Russia in any way because of their absolutely barbaric actions and the atrocities that Russian military have committed in Ukraine. I think they've also really contributed to, again, having these really public conversations about what constitutes Ukrainian identity, right? And one thing that I've often seen people, Ukrainians, saying on social media is that, you know, Ukraine is a political nation, and so it's not really about ethnicity or about kind of what, you know, what your DNA is, but it's about, you know, do you feel that you are part of Ukraine? And I think today that has really coming through, that, you know, people feel part of Ukraine because they share the same values, they you know, share the same support for Ukraine's territorial integrity, and it's not really about where exactly they come from or what language they speak or what language they grew up speaking. Of course, that situation is also changing. Many more people find themselves speaking Ukrainian, deliberately so, choosing to stop speaking Russian, start speaking Ukrainian. But that is just one of you know, a multitude of different things. People also start to learn more about Ukrainian history, listen to more Ukrainian music, learn more about Ukrainian writers, right? And I think that that is all contributing to people really coming together around something, some sort of shared values or shared identity that isn't necessarily just defined by something as simple as language. And I think, again, it really helps that a lot of these discoveries that people are making are, again, kind of, you know, motivated by all these conversations that are happening out in the open. And a lot of people sharing their very personal stories, you know, of their family, their heritage, how come, you know, they are pro-Ukrainian but speak Russian, and explaining this, going back through generations in their family, and explaining, you know, how come that a lot of say educated Ukrainians in certain parts of Ukraine are actually Russian speakers, you know, but that wasn't always the case. And really just I think talking through those personal histories, that kind of is, you know, they're also co-writing the modern history of Ukraine, because suddenly people are learning all of these things about Ukraine as a country, as a society, as a culture that very few people outside Ukraine knew before. And I think that's really important.
Thank you. I have a question that's come in from Clarence Schwab. I'm going to address this to Hannah and Vladimir, either or both of you, if you'd like to take it. Clarence asks, what are Ukraine's specific military objectives this winter from December to February? And I might add, you know, between now and December as well. To what extent can military operations on the ground still proceed, and what would Kyiv be looking to achieve?
You know, that is absolutely, like, I mean, the goals are the same since the day one. It is the full liberation of the Ukrainian territories, including the early occupied Donbass and Crimea. But that is definitely the questions of the realistic approach. What we see now that there are attempts to liberate the south. First of all, we are talking about the Kherson region, where the counteroffensive is happening, where there are better weather because it is warmer, and there are possibilities. At the same time, there is definitely attempts by New Year to come at least to the territories, let's say by February 2022, where we've been, because we're perfectly understanding that tactically and strategically it will be more difficult to work at the territories that's been for 8 years under the occupation. So we are talking now for this first move. Then it is the suppression of the Russian possibilities for the counterattack. And that's why you see that most of the ammunition attacks from Ukrainian side now being used against the ammunition depot or against the critical infrastructure important for the Russian counteroffensive, like bridge in Kherson region, for example. Or even when you hear about Ukraine targeting something at the Russian territory, that is usually either airfield, because many of the missiles are sent not just from the missile system, but from the airplanes, or against the ammunition depot. So that is the two main objectives at the territories that are controlled by the Russian Federation. At the same time, in many places, we see the close combat, we see the artillery combat. So that is definitely happening. And here a lot will depend on the types of the weapons Ukraine will receive. We are definitely asking for the air defense, because that may protect big cities where probably the fighting like in Kiev is not happening, but Russians are targeting them. But if you are coming closer to the battlefield, to the front line, you see that Ukraine is asking for the high precise missiles. We are asking for the artillery ammunition. We are asking for more drones and combat drones. And we are asking for the different types of the weapons that will allow us to target Russian locations, let's say, from the longer distance. Why that is important? Because you understand that is allowing us to save lives of the soldiers, not to come to the close combat. And that is also important considering that Russians are outnumbering us. They can be not so good prepared, or they can have a lot of untrained personnel now, but still when you have a big number, that is big number, and that is what we try to avoid if it is possible.
So that suggests, Hannah, that actual troop movements and fighting in territorial battles can continue through the winter. Am I interpreting you correctly?
Yes, because let's imagine Ukrainian territory is huge. And the weather on the north and on the south is very different. So when somebody is commenting about the how winter it can be mud or it can be snow, let's be honest. In Kherson, we can have the whole winter without snow at all, or with 2 days of snow. But at the same time, in Kharkiv, you can have snow in the end of October. Definitely, that is completely different weather conditions to speak if winter is preferable or not preferable for fighting. In the night, in some regions, it is already, for example, in the Donetsk region, is extremely cold, and you may need the winter uniform. But then we can have January with plus 15 in Ukraine. That's also the reality of the climate here. That's why, as the March and February demonstrated, that weather will influence at the tactical level, but most probably not at the strategic level, the decisions about the counteroffensive.
Okay. Vladimir, do you want to add anything to?
Well, I think Hannah has covered really well the military side of it, but I want to go back to the resilience theme of our conversation. Clearly, we see tons of resilience here in Ukraine, and just non-ending, and just a huge supply there on the part of Ukrainians doing unthinkable, heroic, enormous things. And other day I had a question like, what are the sources of this resilience? And actually, we talked a little bit about it today, but it's interesting. It took me by surprise. Like, really? Okay, so we see it, we have it, but where is it coming from? I think it's a part of our culture, really, democratic culture. We had two Maidans, after all. We had war ongoing since 2014. We have much more pluralistic society in Ukraine comparing to many other places in the former Soviet Union space, including Russia, obviously. So this and many other things are actually, feeding into this resilience that we have. We're also fighting for democracy, that's true. But having said that, this is an important factor and a slogan and reason good enough for people in the West to support Ukraine, that we are fighting for democracy. We're kind of a forepost, the barrier on the path of Russian, aggressive military strife and strides into European hardcore. But at the same time, a lot of people are questioning, like, is democracy good enough? I mean, should we actually be paying too much attention to this? Democracy is under attack in many countries that have been considered historically democratic. Actually, on the way here to US, I went to one event in Warsaw, the OCE event. There was a dialogue on the role of democracy, and we came with conclusion that we are seeing democratic ideals and norms and standards eroding around the globe. Look at what's happening in India, for instance, which is the biggest democracy in the world. What's happening in US, where a lot of people, basically not necessarily honor democracy as a practice or theory, or even see it as a derogatory word, and therefore when some people are saying, but we are supporting Ukraine because they're fighting for democracy, a lot of times people say, okay, so what? I mean, I don't necessarily a big fan of democracy or liberalism for that matter. Liberal democracy is not something I like the previous president of the United States, who is now a leader of opposition in this country. He is saying basically, well, he'd been saying when he was there for 4 years, the liberal international order is not something we like. We would like to get out of it, to do away with it. So That's a problem. And I don't know, Sam, if you were planning to have this question for us, but there's something which is lingering on the minds of many people. Would there be an effect or impact of US midterm elections for Ukraine's assistance in the light of these attitudes and sentiments in US? My personal position is that yes, obviously Trump and his wing of Republican Party will bring more people into the Congress, but at the same time, not in such a big numbers that Ukrainian assistance to Ukraine would be immediate in any immediate danger, because there is almost like a panic mode, frankly, with some Ukrainian journalists and politicians talking about it, and I've been doing a number of interviews, and I'm sure everyone else speaking on this panel did the same thing in previous days. People are saying, okay, like what, November 7th, 8th is election, and then November 9th, the assistance to Ukraine stops. Is that right? And no, of course, the answer is no. But it might be delayed, might be complicated by increased number of Trumpist wing in the parliament, I mean in the Congress, but it wouldn't stop because there is still a lot of good inertia, pro-Ukrainian inertia within political class, media, public in the United States. But this, to conclude my intervention here, I think this is what we need to keep in mind, that just saying that we are fighting for democracy and it's such a sacred thing for everyone in the West, it might not fly in a lot of domestic contexts.
I think that's certainly important to bear in mind, and we will have conversations. I think it's a bit of a fool's errand at the moment to try to predict what's going to happen with the elections themselves in November, but we will at the Democratic Resilience Program at SIPA be coming together with conversations immediately after the elections to talk about what the impact may be. But I think Volodya, you're probably right. There's not much justification for panic, at least on that particular front. In the few moments that we do have left, I'd like to just go back around the virtual table with this question. If you were in a position, and you are in a position, all of you, to give advice to people outside Ukraine, whether it's governments, whether it's ordinary citizens, charitable organizations, journalists, about what they can do to help bolster Ukrainian resilience as this war drags on and becomes in many ways even more tragic. What would that advice be, and to whom? So we go in reverse order. And Volodymyr, I'll start with you.
I think the West is doing enough, really. Right now, their assistance in terms of weapon supply and financial assistance to deal with the issues of IDPs and refugees and just keeping Ukrainian economy afloat is really enough, in my view. Yeah, everything else will be taken care of. I mean, Ukrainians ourselves, with our strong and vibrant civil society, with our resilience, which seems to be bottomless, frankly. I'm surprised, frankly, myself a little bit. I mean, I'm a Ukrainian, lived in Ukraine all my life, but what we saw since February 24th amazed me in a positive way, how in a very dire circumstances, people just came together and they're all contributing in a certain way. So the West should help us to offset this negative implications of the Russian invasion, which is military, which is shelling of our cities, which is ruining of our economy. And I think we Ukrainians would be able to do everything else that is asked of us to protect our country, our sovereignty, our civil society, and to sustain.
Tanya.
Well, that's awfully nice of you, Sam, to give us some time to list some things. I think obviously, the economic support that Vladimir has mentioned is hugely important, and it does contribute to resilience. Helping people keep their homes warm. I think it's also really important for outside supporters to really strive to center Ukrainian voices across academia, across media, across any topic wherever conversations about Ukraine arise, to actually create more spaces for conversations about Ukraine and Ukrainians, and to make sure that those conversations don't happen without Ukrainians, right? I think that's been something we've been asking for a long time. And also to understand, I think Ukrainians have already understood this, that this is probably going to be a long haul game. And so we all need to be resilient, but we also need to be really patient and understand that it's really important to keep Ukraine in the headlines, keep Ukraine at the forefront, but also to continue centering Ukrainian voices and Ukrainian knowledge and Ukrainian experience.
Olga.
Yes, well, I think what is important is to try to avoid the war fatigue or Ukraine fatigue, because this is something that we are already seeing, that Ukraine is disappearing from, the front pages, from TV screens. Well, on days when Kyiv is attacked, maybe it reappears again for some brief time, but then again, the world, there are so many different events happening, and there are so many issues and challenges that is understandable, of course. But, as a Ukrainian, of course, and as a journalist, I want my colleagues, from all over the world to continue focusing on Ukraine, to continue covering Ukraine, to continue being in Ukraine, because it's very important to report on the ground, to be physically in Ukraine, to tell that, the war is not over, that Ukrainians are continuing to suffer. And this is related to my second point, is that, I think we should always remember also the price of this Ukrainian resilience. While we, are all admiring it, we are all praising it, we are all in awe of this Ukrainian resilience, we should also remember, about those thousands of civilians who have been terrorized, who have been killed by missiles, who have been tortured, who have been buried in mass graves, who are, now killed by these kamikaze drones. Today, at least 4 people have died in Kyiv as a result of this terrorist attack. And while, the Ukrainian military is really showing that they are able to repel Russian advances, they are able to retake the territory that has been previously occupied by Russia. And while Russia is unable to win militarily, it continues this campaign of terror. And we should always keep in mind the huge price that Ukrainian, both military and civilians, are paying in this war. And, we should continue talking about them and continue providing assistance to them, especially as the winter approaches and we can expect more Russian attacks on infrastructure objects, on power heating stations. This is going to be a very long, very cold winter for Ukraine. And I hope that people in the West who might also experience, the price rises and the cost of living crisis, as they say here in the UK, they still remember about, the main thing, and about those who are suffering the most, and also about those who is responsible for this crisis, which is Russia.
And Hannah.
That is a good question, but I would probably like not to repeat what my colleague said, but I will start from what Ukraine need is our Western partners to stop panicking. And that is probably another problem in addition to the fatigue about what we are talking about for months. And these panicking regarding the use of the nuclear weapon, for example, not the fear of the nuclear weapon, but the panicking about it, or the panicking about the continuation of the Russian war is really disturbing, because it makes our partners and a lot of politicians to stop thinking strategically and constructively. They are not thinking how to prevent it. They are not thinking what can be done for this. They're just panicking and saying, probably we need to stop supporting Ukraine or to support less because it can provoke Russia more. For me, the only question is, what is more in this war when you see the daily news, when you see what the Russians are doing? And just to say that nuclear is more, sorry, it is not. Now nuclear will not bring more destruction compared to what you already saw in Mariupol. And tell me what you are afraid of, the ephemerical, possible or impossible use of some kind of the nuclear tactical missile, or the war crimes with the several hundred people, civilians being buried after the torture somewhere around Izium. It seems to me that Russians really played very well with this card, and now we should start thinking a little bit more sober about their capabilities, about their possibilities, and about our capabilities, because Russians are also reacting to what are our capabilities, both of Ukraine and of our partners. When Finland and Sweden said that they don't care about Russian opinion and applied for NATO, Russia immediately stopped complaining about their NATO membership. So definitely the military capabilities of the NATO countries are much bigger than the Russian capabilities, including nuclear. So let's think about how we can pose the conditions for them to think, will it be dangerous or not to go extreme? Otherwise, for us just to be afraid of what they can do. That's number one. So stop panicking. That will help. The second is not to make a big gap between promises and implementations. That's also the question, especially when we speak about the weapons delivery. Vladimir said that probably Ukraine receives enough. First of all, it's never enough when we speak about the active combat, because it's not that you delivered something and you still have the same amount. You're losing it in the combat. Then from time to time, we need different type of the weapon. So that's also something to be discussed. But in general, sometimes we have the promises from the countries, and then it takes several months for delivery. Time is what is not in favor of Ukraine. Time is in favor of Russia. So we need quicker, we need without delays, and we need delivery of what is already promised. And then definitely what we already started thinking, it is the reconstruction of the country, rehabilitation of the country, because for all of us, it is the interest for Ukraine not to become a failed state. And failed state is not only political issues. Here we're we're okay. But the question is with the economy, with the financial system, the longer war is happening, the more difficult it is to keep Ukraine functioning. And Ukrainian economy is important for resilience, for the future. And sometimes it's just the question of the physical infrastructure recovery that we need at the liberated territories. And that's where the assistance will be needed for, I'm afraid that not even months, as we are talking about much longer perspective.
Thank you. We will continue these conversations. As all the speakers have said, this is a war that unfortunately is not going anywhere, and even when the war does, the aftermath and the need for reconstruction will remain. So thank you very much for being with us this afternoon, this evening, this morning, wherever you are in the world. We've been very privileged to have with us again Hannah Shelest, Olga Tokaryuk, Tatiana Lokat, and Vladimir Dubovic. I'm sorry, I very nearly said Zelensky. If you don't follow them individually on Twitter and off Twitter in their writings and their professional work, you absolutely should. If you don't follow SIPA, you should do that as well. I've been Sam Green, and I will look forward to seeing you back here and elsewhere again. In the meantime, stay safe.